So when we think about pest control, the big key is everybody seems to have a different issue or concern. There's general ones across the industry, but everybody seems to have similar ones. And probably you need to think about what's most important to you at this time and recognize many cultivars have different susceptibilities. So you don't need to spray for everything on every cultivar, but you need to be aware which ones might be, as I call them, the canaries, the ones that will show you symptoms very quickly. Second part is, or third part is, not all pests are present during the whole season. So blanket spraying for everything all the time is not really going to make a lot of sense. The fourth one is, how much time do I have to apply the controls? In most cases, you want to be able to cover your vineyard, hopefully within a single day for application. Weather conditions can change dramatically, and you need to think about those. And probably the other one is, how much do you really want to spend? A number of the pesticides that I'm going to talk about are pretty pricey. I've included some 2023 pricing that we did in Ontario, and I think you need to take a look at it. And lastly, you need to really think about the restrictions. Some of them have re-entry intervals. Some of them have pre-harvest intervals. You may need to be concerned about phytotoxicity of following one product with another. There's always a lot of different things to concern yourself with, and you have to take the time to do that. In 2024, from my observations from last year, coming into this year, there is a high amount of overwintering inoculum. So what this means is we saw a lot of downy mildew, we saw black rot, things, which means there's high amount of inoculum present coming into 2024. Not everything is rotted down. So sanitation, some cultural practices to minimize potential for infection is important. The other part is, if you exceed your fertilization rates over your needs, you can get too much vegetative growth. Soft vegetative growth often leads to more disease problems. It can lead to aggressive canopy development, which will lead to shading, which will lead to the environmental conditions, which can cause problems. Another one is, we have a lot of vines that have been weakened. They are not 100% yet going into 2024. The hybrids are in better shape, but even those suffered some injury last year. So you need to really think about the fact that you're dealing with something that's probably a little more susceptible to infection than expected. Crown gall, especially for the vinifera people. There's nothing registered for topical application or effective for crown gall after the infection symptom is observed. There has been suggestions about specific products or comments on them. None of them are effective. I've been dealing with crown gall for 40 years, and there is nothing you can spray on it once you observe the crown gall. This is a situation of crown gall, of retraining from below the gall infection and developing a new trunk and scaffold. High weed pressure also. It has growth, especially close to where the leaves are. You can modify the environment, keeping it moist. You're limiting drying or reducing the rate of drying of leaves. This can also lead to higher disease infection levels. So disease control is really important, and weed pressure and weed control is vitally important. There was a session last week by Sonny Murray on weed control. If you have not taken a look at it, hopefully we'll get it posted relatively soon, and it's something you can incorporate into your. So what do you need to consider when you're thinking about your program? You have to understand, and last year was probably the prime example of how fast was it, or how well does it stick? Frequent, regular rains can lead to a lot of headaches. Last year, in summary, we had 54 days out of 92 days with precipitation measured. This makes it incredibly hard to look at materials you want to use. Contact materials do not stick as well as locally systemic, nor as well as systemic materials. The other part is needing to understand, when is your vine most susceptible? This is critical to time your applications. Be aware of fungicide resistance. It exists, and we need to undertake resistance management strategies. And as always, you're never spraying for one disease. Often there are multiple there at the same time. And similarly, you have to also consider a number of products have a maximum number of applications, and some have fairly restrictive re-entry intervals or pre-harvest intervals. And as a grower coming out of a tough year last year and going into a year where probably your cropping levels won't be 100%, price of products also always comes to the forefront, and you need to think about that. Understanding how fungicides in particular, and I'm going to talk about for this most of this discussion, how do they act? Are they protectants, or can you apply them post-infection? In other words, a curative, so that an infection has taken place. You may not see the symptom, but can you cure it? Can you prevent further sporulation and the exponential increase of the pest? Or is it an eradicant where you can kill the colony after the symptoms appear? Both post-infection and antisporulant are before the symptoms appear. Very few traditional fungicides have any eradicant activity. Most of them are topical treatments. A non-systemic or contact material, it only stays with, material remains on the surface where it was applied. It may be redistributed over that particular leaf or removed by rainfall, but is not going to move to new growth. Unsprayed tissues are not protected with contact materials. Leaves produced after a spray, new growing tips and points, they're not protected either. So contact materials can be considered a protectant before the infection or eradicant after the infection. We highly suggest that contact materials be applied on sunny, dry conditions to get a quick drying level. You get better absorption on the plant surface, and they definitely are more rain-fast over several days. And you try to apply these materials, and hopefully within 7 hours or more before rainfall, it may still be in a slightly soluble form and wash off. As a general rule of thumb, we consider for every inch of rain, you would lose half of the residual or length of time of control. And if you do get 2 inches of more rain in a single event, much of the residue is gone and you would probably need to reapply. Materials you can apply under slightly different conditions. Often under humid and clouding conditions when the soil is wet, so the vines are not under water stress, allows the greatest absorption of systemic and locally systemic materials. Most leaves develop a cuticle or wax layer that covers it, and by having the soil moist, it allows the product to move into the leaf tissue quite easily. But when it's extremely hot and dry, the cuticle or wax layer becomes flattened and less permeable. So those products may not be absorbed or remain on the plant surface and break down as a result of ultraviolet light. So you have to consider the conditions. Also, systemic fungicides should never be used on heavily sporulating colonies, as your likelihood of promoting resistance or selecting mutant and resistant populations increases. Use a contact fungicide first, if appropriate, to try and kill those spores before you'd use a systemic. So a systemic can work in a couple of ways. The material enters the plant and spreads to other organs via the vascular system. In other words, it will move along. So you hit a few leaves and it hits everything. Newly protected leaves may be protected depending on the rate of movement of the product. If there's a period of incredibly rapid growth of the grapevine, generally newly produced leaves are not as well protected because the growth rate exceeds the ability of the material to get there. Unsprayed tissues are protected that were there previous at the time of application. A second type is to look at locally systemic. Now, these are slightly different than truly systemic products. Here, the material moves and enters within the plant tissues. It's somewhat rain-fast. But it is only those tissues in which it hits does it move within them. It does not move throughout the whole plant. Leaves that grow after an application are not protected. Unsprayed leaves, in other words, those that didn't receive any contact, are also not protected. So this is what we're talking about when we deal with locally systemic. They're often what they call translaminar. You spray on one side of the leaf and it penetrates and moves through the entire leaf, and it will move to the other side. This gives the leaf full protection that has been contacted, but it doesn't move to other parts of the grapevine. The critical thing is to think about critical growth stages for disease control. There are lots of different growth stages that are listed, but fundamentally we can break them into some key components, from bud break through to about 20 centimeters of growth, from 20 centimeters onwards, but we also hit the immediate pre-bloom period as a critical time, as well as fruit set. The next critical phase is probably pea-sized berries, where just before you've hit berry touch, veraison, the beginning of ripening, and finally harvest. If we look at it this way, powdery and downy mildew, phomopsis, black rot, and anthracnose is really critical at the early part of the season. So these are the ones I want to encourage you to really think about up until we get to the immediate pre-bloom, which is going to be probably in the June period. But for the next part, until then, your 20 centimeters is your critical part. As you can see, powdery, downy, black rot, and anthracnose can continue on through the season, and then powdery and downy at the end. However, powdery, downy, black rot, and anthracnose can occur later, and botrytis can hit at multiple stages. Early season pest control. So in other words, you're trying to look at what do I do every 7 to 10 days? And I'm going to use some of the general products that are listed. If we look at it, what I mean by C and E means contact eradicant, slight action. So sulfurs and oils, which also fit into the organics, and I will talk about organic materials later. Or you've got copper, queva, full pets, mancozebs, a material like Diplomat, Lifeguard, which is one of the new biorationals, and Captans. You start to take a look at, you need to reapply these materials because they're contact with limited movement. In fact, no systemic activity. You have to apply every 7 to 10 days to make sure you cover new growth during wet weather. Here's the critical point. Understand what type of products they are. If you're looking at powdery mildew, which is not as much on hybrids, but more you're looking at downy, phomopsis, and black rot, then you need to start looking at what products will give me a range of activity. In this particular situation, you'll notice the coppers really don't do a lot for phomopsis, cane and leaf spot. And it's marginal at best, some suppression for black rot. If you look at a product like queva, not as strong on powdery mildew, but very strong on downy mildew, and similarly for black rot. If powdery is not your concern at the beginning of the year, downy, phomopsis, black rot, and anthracnose are. Now you might be wanting to look at something like the full pets. Diplomat is another one. Again, if you've got a black rot issue, you don't have anthracnose, you might want to be looking along this route. Similarly, Lifeguard, one of the new materials. Again, repetitively applied is important. And finally, Captans, which are very similar to that of the full pet materials. They're in the same groups. They do give some action on anthracnose. So you need to know what you're looking for and when you're running into it. Here's where some of the caveats come in. If we think of re-entry intervals early in the season, lots to be done. Still pruning, still tying, maybe some shoot positioning, some other things happening as well. The re-entry intervals, if you look at sulfurs and oils, you've got 12, 24 hours, not too bad. Similarly for coppers. However, as we start to move into things like the full pets, or even in particular, Captan, 55 days re-entry. Those are critical things you have to remember. Worker safety and label requirements are critical. Now, people are asking, how much does it cost? Sulfurs are inexpensive. The oils are reasonably priced. As you notice, copper, Lifeguard start to climb in cost, and the need for reapplication, especially with Lifeguard and other materials. Even Diplomat, if you notice, $105 a hectare per application. That may take it out of your arsenal just because of the economics. And generally, they're looking at minimum applications of 300 liters minimum of material per hectare. In other words, your solution. So if you look at it, if you use sulfur and full pet, if you're dealing with the vinifera, because these are sulfur-based, full pet, mancozeb, or Lifeguard, you're anywhere from $42 to $68 per hectare, and you cover a wide range. However, if you're using oil and full pet or oil and mancozeb, now you're changing things a bit. You can use them on hybrids. Now you're getting into the $49 up to $75 per hectare, I'm sorry. Now understand that oils will suppress Perennia mealybugs and scale, and there is some hope that we'll also get some suppression of phylloxera, though that's not been proven at this point. And finally, the last group, queva, Diplomat, as you notice, there the prices go up incredibly dramatically per application. This is the thing to remember. Add up the number of sprays you apply per year, start to take a look at your economics, and then it comes to really explain itself to you. All right, so you've gotten to the 20 centimeter, you're going to go through the bloom period. From 20 centimeters onward, you need to, again, treating with contact materials. You're looking at roughly every 7 to 10 days. If you're dealing with locally systemic materials, yes, you need to reapply every 7 to 10 days. As I had mentioned earlier, locally systemic does not protect newly expanding leaves or new shoot growth or new cluster development. So you have to reapply on a regular basis. Now, what I've introduced here is the groups. And this is critical because powdery mildew resistance is across North America. New York State has a tremendous amount of it. There will be some, I guarantee, in Nova Scotia, whether it's already happened or is about to occur and be found. Really important to remember which ones. What I wanted to draw your attention to is anything in the same group cannot be used or should not be used in consecutive sprays. So if you're taking a look at this one, group 3, but then you see Appruvia and Inspire Super also have another group with them, the dilemma is they are also considered group 3. So all of those first ones up to Flint should not be used in consecutive sprays. So if we look at, we expand this and add other material into there, and looking again at powdery mildew, notice none of these have any activity on downy mildew. So this whole group that you're looking at should not be relied upon for downy mildew control. Some of them have activity on black rot. They do have activity on powdery, but downy is not their strong point. And all of them have differential times for reentry. An example is a product Prewin. It has a 17-day reentry. Maravon has a 21-day reentry. Those are the critical things to think about, especially if you're doing in-season work. It's really important. ProBlad is a product I bring your attention to. It's one of the new biorationals, completely new group, but you're looking at a minimum of 5 applications with it. So there's your group. Remember, all those that had a 3 in it were grouped together. However, you have to take a look at and say, okay, fine, I'm going to go from a group 3 to group 7. Well, the minute you've used your group 7, you've now really restricted yourself as to what you can follow up with. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So if you've already used Appruvia top, you've basically taken out group 3 and group 7 at the same time for future use in your next spray. Property and Vivando are 2 other products that have come in, very strong on powdery mildew, but again, the same thing. You need to be aware of where they can fit and their economics. Locally systemic. 4-star on powdery, very strong materials, but they're locally systemic, so you need to reapply. There's the products that you can look at for black rot fairly early, but again, we really don't have the downy mildew control that we'd like. Luna Tranquility and Miravis Prime, again, work very well. We'll give you the additional materials for black rot, but again, fairly restricted and are expensive. And sulfurs, again, down there, not so much on their, they're really a powdery mildew material, and they're contact material as well. So if we start to look at and say, okay, we need to start to look at, and we add anthracnose to the situation, this is where it gets a little important, but also understanding resistance management. Powdery mildew is resistant in Ontario, New York, and many other places. So fundamentally, Nova is no longer considered a reasonable material being used for powdery mildew control. Some people may be able to use it in Nova Scotia in very, what I would call judicious ways and get good results with it. But it's critical to remember that resistance exists in North America and is developed fairly quickly. Similarly, Flint and Sovereign are 2 products that were also promoted, used very heavily in the United States, and were used repetitively. Resistance developed very quickly. Flint and Sovereign, which had some activity on downy mildew, were also found to be resistant. Downy mildew organism was resistant to them as well. So that took them out of the situation. Inspire Super, there was product in it. Again, it was developed in terms of resistance and not particularly good. So I highlight this word resistance because it's probably one of the big things that you need to be aware of and want to think about on a routine basis. So now if we look at some of the other materials coming along, so we've got Prewin, Apruvia, you've got powdery, pristine, there's resistance relative to downy that people are concerned about. So again, this is more the mid-season if we're past the downy mildew phase and that bloom period where powdery can be a real problem. It's something to be aware of. Pristine, functionally the same as Cantus. Another product, again, we have some resistance, works well on black rot and others, but you may need to add another material relative to powdery mildew and others. The group 7s, Apruvia, Cantus, Circatus, Apruvia Top, Luna Tranquility, Miravis Prime, and Miravan. Again, they're all in the same group, so they cannot be used in consecutive sprays. Similarly, Property and Vivando are of the same group, so you can't rotate by saying I'll spray Property and then I'll use Vivando in the next spray. You need to break in between these applications of a particular group at least one time with something totally different. Otherwise, resistance. If we look at the other materials that are out there, we've got Forum, Revis, Zampro. There are the phosphoric acids that are particular to downy mildew control, very important. A material such as Lifeguard, coppers, Quava, Fulpets, Diplomat, and Torrent, and Stargus all have activity on downy mildew. So these are ones that you may want to work into your program. Similarly, you may want to look at relative to black rot control. The coppers and Quava under low pressure may give you some suppression. If you have an outbreak of it, I would not be relying on those for control. The activity pattern for Forum, it's systemic. Revis is locally systemic. The phos acids are moderately systemic. Lifeguard, and then all the others, the coppers through to Stargus, are just contact materials. Again, group 40s can't be followed with one another, but here's your strength relative to downy mildew. Quava is one of the few ones that will give you good action relative to powdery mildew and downy mildew at the same time, and a little bit of activity for botrytis. Similarly, Diplomat fits in for powdery and downy, but does not give you any assistance relative to black rot. Again, moving along, we need to consider botrytis and where it's going to come into play. If you've got issues with powdery mildew, and we had people last year who ran into severe powdery mildew, depending on the cultivar, Millstop is a product of bicarbonates that can be used on anything. Sulfur, you're fairly restricted if you had a severe powdery mildew impact on hybrid grapes. However, the stylet oils and vegetable oils and others can kill the superficial mycelium on the leaves and berries, but you need to follow it with other materials. These locally systemic products are not considered eradication. They will darken out the old infection, but you definitely have to be protected going into the future. This is kind of a last stretch resort when you've got to run after something that's got away from you. Think about resistance. For downy mildew, the phosphorus acid products are the ones that people have looked at. When you see active mycelium, it will kill the superficial mycelium on the leaves and the berries, and it moves from spray tissues to new growth. In many cases, with these phos acid materials, you have to use them in back-to-back sprays. Resistance is not a serious concern with the phos acid products, but it's used in back-to-back because it's superficial mycelium. What that means is the mycelium that you observe on the outside of the leaves, outside of the berries, can be killed. However, if there's new growth inside, imagine they're like tree roots that are suddenly sending up new shoots, or like quackgrass that suddenly you kill the top and then it regrows. Phos acids do not kill the interior ones. You have to apply at least over 2 sprays to try and gain some modicum of control of this. Think about as we continue, and we always have to look at costs. Now, the numbers I've been giving you on the cost per hectare, they don't include application costs. So you have to look at your labor time, your equipment time, your fuel costs, all these things above and beyond the values. So when we looked here, And I was showing you relative to from 20 centimeters through 6 weeks post-bloom. Here's your range of cost per hectare. At that point, you're looking at 600 liters of fluid per hectare is what has been recommended. So these are the kind of things that you need to keep in your mind. As reentry intervals are not bad. The longest one on here is, if you look at the full pets, were 3 days, but the cost can change. You can go from anywhere from, down as low as $41 a hectare up to, well, $105 a hectare. If we add diplomat and throw it into the mix for powdery and downy, but not black rot, we're up to $162 a hectare. So again, powdery mildew costs, these are the ones I've shown you a little bit earlier. If powdery mildew is your issue and you need forward protection, you look at the locally systemic ones in mid-season and later when your leaf area is fairly full. There you want to start taking a look at what are your costs, what are your options, but also make sure you rotate out of those groups. I'm going to include some charts later on that I've been revising and updating that if you want them, please let me know and I will send them along to help you when you start to look at product selection. The products are expensive. Can I just use cheaper protectants instead of systemics? And relying back to my pathology friends, sure, if you meet the following coverage requirements, you need excellent coverage. You got to be able to spray the entire vineyard in a day in case there's potential for heavy rain. Can you work with longer reentry intervals if you had to by picking particular products? Also, there's fewer applications allowed each year. The PMRA and label regulations keeps changing every year, especially for some of the older products. So it's important to be aware of those. And you're going to have to anticipate there's going to be some losses. You're going to miss a few infection periods, or you're going to have extended rainfall periods. Yes, you can gain control, but you'll also have to put up with some of the losses. You need to practice resistance management. Nova Scotia is a young industry and has not seen a dramatic amount coming. It's everywhere in the world, and after a number of years, every grape growing region in the world sees these types of things develop. So in other words, don't try to use any resistant groups. In other words, the truly systemic, and you should never use more than one application of a botrytis-specific product per season. Try and stay away from that. Remember, a co-formulation of 2 different groups counts as 1 use for each group. Those products I showed you that were 3+7 or other combinations, that considers as a single use, and you need to go totally away from both of those groups in your next spray. Try and avoid, where possible, locally systemic products if you've got active sporulation and it's easy to see. No back-to-backs of any same group, and always use the full label rates. There is some other caveats. There have been changes. You have to be aware of tank mix restrictions based on the labels. You have to be aware of the federal label requirements and registration requirements regarding any potential tank mixing. Keep track of how many times you've used any particular product. You should always have a good spray record regardless for your processor at the end. And find out if the processors have any preferred pre-harvest intervals. Not necessarily in Nova Scotia, but they might. But in some areas of the world, often processors have longer than label requirements for pre-harvest intervals for particular products. Always check with your processor to find out whether there's any longer periods of pre-harvest interval. Coming along again, powdery and downy, late season when you're looking at from veraison through to harvest. Here's some of the relative disease susceptibilities, as well as sensitivities to sulfur and copper. As you notice, most of the hybrids have an issue relative to sulfur or labruscas. And these are charts taken from the Perennia Pest Management Guidelines of 2023, which is now being radically updated for 2024 to be an electronic format that you can access through your phone apps. I'll show you a slide later. There's a session coming up in April with respect to that. Some have copper sensitivity. You just have to be aware of them. An example of things that are grown, there's no sulfur sensitivity relative to Frontenac or Frontenac Gris. However, copper is not 100% sure. Lackady is unknown at this moment. I've met people last year that used sulfur in some cases and had issues, and other times they didn't run into issues. So This is a site-by-site kind of historical thing that you have to develop on your own. And finally, New York Muscat. Again, it's not well known, it's not published. A lot of these charts came from New York and Ontario. Hopefully in Nova Scotia, we can get some more up-to-date data. If you're looking at it, Eutypa is something that we really don't spray for. It's in the chart, but it's just showing you that there's potential sensitivities to them. If you're looking at organic options, you always have to think about your application intervals, how you can rotate, can you use them regularly, and following the label instructions. The dilemma with most organic materials is that they don't last as long as truly systemic materials. The predominant ones are more so a contact material, generally easily washed off, and sometimes there's compatibility issues with other products. I use the term scouting is critical. This is probably one of the things that you're already doing, but hopefully you can quantify to a certain degree. I've done a lot of work over the years relative to people doing scouting, and it's something that you need to do on a routine basis, weekly, taking a look and understanding crop development stage, susceptibility, presence of symptoms, all of those things come into play, and they will help set your spray program up and your pest control program up far better by knowing what's happening at your vineyard. What's happening at your neighbors or what's happening across the province elsewhere does not necessarily mean it will happen at your site. So that's why individual site monitoring is very important in scouting. What I did was take some of the charts that were in the Perennia guideline and have sort of put them into groups. Here's an example of some of the things where there's materials that are considered organic, but they're contact, using Serenade. And this is sorted by looking at the groupings. These charts, I have available in PDF format for you if you want them. Most included are Lifeguard, lime sulfur, disperse, millstop, oxidate. These are all materials. Some of them stronger than others, but it's really critical that you take a look at and understand how they work and whether they will fit in your program. I was surprised when I did go through about how many products are actually registered as organically certified. I give you the caveat with this. This is what we found from reading through a number of the literature. You still need to check with your organic certifying agency if you're going to look for organic certification. Those are the ones you should be following their listing of what is considered acceptable or not. I know there are multiple agencies that will certify organic, but you need to check with them directly to find out exactly which product will accept and will not. So when we went through, I know in the pest management booklet for 2023 online, they list the fungicides by alphabetically. So what I've done is also edit this somewhat or reorganize it such that you could see, you could look very quickly if you want to sort through and find out what the product is, what group it belongs to, and then that can help you look at, if you're looking at additional products, then you can find and check something for, well, such as Alliette for downy mildew, it's a P7, and I want to follow up with Seva. Well, that's okay. It's a group 3. I can do that. But I certainly couldn't follow up with Confine Extra because it's in the same category as Alliette. Those are the type of things that you have to make decisions on and follow up from point to point. Each spray needs to be looked at. And what I often suggest to people is they sketch out a program at the beginning of the year, product 1, right through, pick random dates or establish your dates over the growing season, and just write out a generalized program and then go back and take a look at it and make sure that you're not following one product with another from the same group. Here's another one that you can follow through. There's products such as Full Pan, which are multi-site. The likelihood of resistance are pretty low when you start to look at the activity. However, when you look at something like Elevate, which was for botrytis, it's locally systemic, but also can be very prone to resistance if you use it repetitively in consecutive sprays. And as you see, the list kept getting longer and longer as I started to go back to what was coming along. An example of an interesting one was Oxidate, which is a contact material, organic, has some activity across the spectrum, but it's repetitive application. In many cases, the star indicates it's listed for suppression, not for control. Pristine is another that has a pretty good range on it. Somewhat expensive, but it's a locally systemic, so it will give you something that it contacts and it will control those diseases at that point. But after about 7 to 10 days, the amount of material that's left behind is pretty low, and you need to reapply with something else. Switch is another one, strictly for botrytis. Scala is strictly for botrytis. Again, those are expensive products if it's for botrytis. And you're looking at particular cultivars. Saval, I know, has issues. A number of the vinifera, if you're dealing with Pinots or possibly Chardonnay. And the adverse weather we get close to harvest is something that you need to take into account. But we can deal with that in the future. This is probably the biggest thing I want to get across. There's an online pest management guide that's coming up. And they're going to have a day explaining how to use that. I highly recommend that you register for it. This is something that some people may use right on their phone. They're out in the vineyard. They've got something that they can take a look at. They have an idea what it is, and they can look very quickly on deciding what products might be used.